It's 10 o'clock. The BBC News now on BBC One with Fiona Bruce and Catherine Carpenter.
If there was any possibility that he could develop weapons of mass destruction, we should stop him. That was my view. That was my view then, that's my view now.
Tony Blair appears before the Iraq Inquiry and stands by his decision to topple Saddam Hussein. During 6 hours of questioning, the former Prime Minister insists the decision to go to war was the right one.
Tony Blair! War criminal! Tony Blair! War criminal!
Protesters demand an apology. Tony Blair expresses no personal regrets about the invasion, save one.
In the end, it was divisive, and I'm sorry about that. And I tried my level best to bring people back together again.
He says that 9/11 changed everything and prompted a total reassessment of the risk posed by Saddam Hussein. After a day of evidence from Mr. Blair, we'll be looking at whether we're any closer to understanding how and why Britain went to war with Iraq. Also tonight, Toyota recalls 200,000 cars in the UK after a safety scare over their accelerator pedals. And where are the tents? The Haitian government says they're in this field. Yet again, the people of Haiti have to fend for themselves.
In BBC London News, the man on trial for murdering a colleague and scattering his body parts over 2 counties changes his plea to guilty, and anger at how much London businesses will have to pay towards Crossrail.
Good evening. If anyone was expecting Tony Blair to express personal regrets as he made his much anticipated appearance before the Iraq Inquiry today, they will have been disappointed. It was an unrepentant and very confident former Prime Minister that gave evidence during 6 hours of questioning. Mr. Blair explained why he believed then, and still believes now, that going to war with Iraq was the right decision. He claimed that after the attacks of 9/11, what he called the calculus of risk changed, that Saddam Hussein and what were thought to be his weapons of mass destruction could no longer go unchallenged. First tonight, Nicholas Witcher reports on Tony Blair's day of evidence, and his report contains some flash photography.
He arrived in the half-light of dawn to the sound of a single bell tolling. Tony Blair's convoy headed for the basement. Moments earlier, he'd slipped in through a side door. It was a low-key start to a highly charged day.
Tony Blair! War criminal!
In the streets around the conference centre were the protesters, not as many as some had predicted, a couple of hundred at most, whose verdict on Tony Blair has already been decided.
Fair right! Thousands die! Fair right!
Security was tight. Tempers were occasionally frayed.
We're going to have a police state, at least organise it properly.
Standing in line were some of those whose lives were changed by the Iraq War. These were some of the families who lost sons and daughters and husbands, waiting for their chance to hear the former Prime Minister in person. At 9:30, the session began. Mr. Blair took his place. He looked pensive.
Good morning.
Morning.
I would like to start by welcoming our witness.
Sir John Chilcot said many people wanted answers, but he reminded everyone that this wasn't a trial. And so the Iraq Inquiry began its questioning of Tony Blair. They went to the event which changed so much, 9/11, an attack in which Iraq played no part, but which ultimately was to seal Saddam Hussein's fate.
The crucial thing after September the 11th is that the calculus of risk changed.
Someone like Saddam Hussein, Mr. Blair said, with his history of defiance over weapons of mass destruction, had to be confronted.
The primary consideration for me was to send an absolutely powerful, clear and unremitting message that after September the 11th, if you were a regime engaged in WMD, you had to stop.
Mr. Blair flatly denied the suggestion that he'd signed in blood with George Bush in April 2002 to invade Iraq, but he did say that he'd wanted Britain to be alongside the Americans.
I'd said we would stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We did in Afghanistan, and I was determined to do that again.
So what precisely had George Bush understood from that?
What he took from that was exactly what he should have taken, which is that if it came to military action, because there was no way of dealing with this diplomatically, we would be with him.
Then to regime change, an illegal policy, but had Mr. Blair embraced it?
No, the absolutely key issue was the WMD issue.
But the line between regime change and disarmament seemed at times to be blurred.
I think there is a danger that we end up with a very sort of binary distinction between regime change here and WMD here.
But what about his recent BBC interview with Fern Britton? If he'd known that there were no WMD, would he still have gone ahead?
I would still have thought it right to remove him.
Mr. Blair said he hadn't been fully prepared. It was the only moment when he didn't have a ready answer.
With all my experience in dealing with interviews, it still indicates that I've got something to learn about it.
On the Iraq dossier of September 2002, Mr. Blair defended his categoric statement that he believed beyond doubt that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
I did believe it. I mean, and I did believe it, frankly, beyond doubt.
He was satisfied that the invasion had been lawful. He was in no doubt that contrary views in Cabinet had been heard. He was sure that Britain had had proper plans for the aftermath. He was convinced that what he did was right.
It isn't about a lie or a conspiracy or a deceit or a deception. It's a decision. And the decision I had to take was, given Saddam's history, given his use of chemical weapons, given the over 1 million people whose deaths he caused, given 10 years of breaking UN resolutions, could we take the risk of this man reconstituting his weapons programs?
At the end, Sir John Chilcot invited Mr. Blair to talk about regrets.
We, like you, have also experienced at first hand the anger which is still felt by many people in this country. Can I ask whether you have regrets?
I had to take this decision as Prime Minister, and it was a huge responsibility then, and there's not a single day that passes by that I don't reflect and think about that responsibility, and so I should. In the end, it was divisive, and I'm sorry about that. And I tried my level best to bring people back together again.
And no regrets?
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein. I think he was
Be quiet, please.
I think that he was a monster. I believe he threatened not just the region, but the world. And in the circumstances that we faced then, but I think even if you look back now, it was better to deal with this threat, to deal with it, to remove him from office. And I do genuinely believe that the world is safer as a result.
Mr. Blair had had his say, but as he left the inquiry room, some of those in the public gallery were in tears. Anyone hoping for a grilling of the former Prime Minister today will have been disappointed. What we've witnessed here has been a defiant and at times passionate defence by Tony Blair of his decisions on Iraq. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Iraq Inquiry.
So a full day of evidence at the Iraq Inquiry, and our political editor Nick Robinson was there and watched every exchange. He looks now at whether a defiant Tony Blair has made it any clearer how and why he took Britain to war, and his report contains some flash photography.
Regrets. He's had very few. Too few to mention.
Why didn't you say sorry today, Mr. Blair?
Even after 6 long hours of giving evidence to the Iraq Inquiry. Not content with merely answering questions, Tony Blair wanted to ask them today. What would have happened, he asked, not in 2003, but now, in 2010, if the Iraq War had never happened?
Sometimes what's important is not to ask the March 2003 question, but to ask the 2010 question. Supposing we had backed off, he would have had the intent, he would have had the financial means, and we would have lost our nerve.
In other words, he was claiming that Iraq would quickly have rebuilt the weapons of mass destruction, which were never found. Not content with defending the controversial war to oust Saddam Hussein and not apologising for its chaotic aftermath, he went on to hint that another war might be necessary, this time against Iran.
I think we live in a completely new security environment today. I thought that then, I think that now. It's why I've said this to you a number of times today. I take a very hard, tough line on Iran today, and many of the same arguments apply.
Iran's repressive regime, its nuclear weapons programme and its links with terrorist groups posed a similar risk to that posed by Iraq, he said. It too could not be ignored. The Iraq inquiry insisted that today was not a trial, but Tony Blair knew that his reputation was in the dock today.
Most people who will have listened to what Tony Blair had to say today will have had their suspicions confirmed that when all is said and done, this was a decision that he took to go to war in Iraq to serve the interests of the White House rather than serve the interests of the British people.
Clearly, some of the information that was put in front of Parliament, the dodgy dossier, for instance, was just unacceptable and wrong and shouldn't happen again. But I think we have got to wait for Chilcot's full report before we can come to a full conclusion.
Outside the Iraq inquiry were many who had made their minds up. Inside, sitting just feet away from Tony Blair, was a man who shouted, "Come on, a regret man."
It was just the kind of audacity of Tony Blair to talk about, openly about the fact that 100,000 people that he would accept have died, have been killed, and have no regrets about it. I mean, I think a lot of people in the room, because there was a lot of families, obviously, were feeling really frustrated.
Today, appropriately enough, Gordon Brown was meeting the Palestinian leader. Soon he knows it will be his turn to be asked whether he has regrets about the war which inflamed the Middle East. Tony Blair behaved today like a man frustrated that a war backed by his cabinet, by Parliament and the opposition now seems to be defended by him and him alone. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Westminster.
The relatives of service personnel who were killed in Iraq have expressed anger and dismay over Tony Blair's lack of regrets. A number of families were allowed into the inquiry to hear his reasons for sending their loved ones into war. So what are their thoughts tonight? Our special correspondent, Razi Iqbal, has been speaking to some of those who listened to Tony Blair.
No, I don't think he did die fighting for a cause.
They do their job, and that job is not to question. Our job is just to support our loved ones.
It may now be almost 7 years since the UK was led to war, but the silent presence of the 179 soldiers who died in Iraq loomed over today's proceedings. The passage of time counts for nothing to those who continue to struggle to come to terms with their loss. Val O'Neill got a ticket to listen to Mr Blair today. Her son Chris died in 2007.
Our main story this morning, Tony Blair has arrived to give evidence to the Iraq inquiry.
He was killed just 3 weeks before he was due home. As she prepared to attend the inquiry, she wondered if Mr Blair remembered all those who had died.
I look at him and see the life he's living, the conferences he's doing, the talks he's doing, the seminars, the houses he's buying. And you think, it's a nice life, but would it have been a nice life for our children that died? Does he ever stop to think that there is 179 children, because that's what they were?
Only some of the relatives got tickets for the main room. The open ballot allowed a limited number of families to each session. Val O'Neill stayed all day, and as demonstrators made their voices heard, she shared her thoughts.
I needed to see Tony Blair and listen to what he had to say. And what he's had to say has made me exceptionally angry, really angry. Especially, I've been in the family room this afternoon watching the TV with the other families. We waited right to the very end for him to apologise. So John Chilcot gave him the opportunity to apologise to the families, and he didn't apologise.
No words, though, will bring those lost back. Sarah Chapman's brother, Sergeant Robert O'Connor, was killed in a Hercules aircraft accident 5 years ago.
When you're a military family, it's your job to love that person of your family that is actually within the armed forces or emergency services, and they do their job, and that job is not to question. Our job is just to support our loved ones.
At a memorial service last year, Peter Briley refused to shake Mr Blair's hand, accusing him of having blood on his hands. Mr Briley's son, Sean, died in the first year of the war.
Some of the questions seem to throw me. He usually has he's cocky, self-assured Mr Blair. I went this morning, he was struggling to answer some of the questions because they'd really got to him.
For the bereaved, Mr Blair's momentary discomfort today contrasts with their raw pain. While Iraq will exercise historians and experts for years, little will change for the families affected. For them, the fallen remain fallen. Razia Iqbal, BBC News.
Our political editor Nick Robinson is at the QE2 Centre in London, where Tony Blair gave his evidence today. Nick, we were hearing the families there, and Mr Blair was asked twice at the inquiry, just towards the end, if he had any regrets. He didn't seem to.
No, and he must have known the question was coming. At every inquiry session that I've been to, there's been a moment at the end where that sort of question is posed to those who are involved. And he chose, therefore, deliberately not to express his regret, despite the fact he knew that victims' families would be watching. He claimed that the victims, and he put a number on it, of around 100,000. He said they were the responsibility of Al-Qaeda who'd gone into Iraq, of Iranian-backed forces who'd done it too. My hunch is that he decided that after 6 hours of evidence today, he didn't want people to remember the questions about the legal advice, about the secret alleged meetings with George Bush. He wanted the country instead to focus on the fact that he had warned about a danger facing us and the world, was still warning of it, and wanted the credit at least for taking a brave decision.
And after all the hours of evidence from Mr Blair today, did we learn anything new?
Well, inside the room I learnt one thing. There are things you see which you can't see on camera. I saw a man very frightened indeed. I've not seen him look like that for many, many years, before he got into his stride. His face was taut with fear at one point. His hand shook when he unscrewed the bottle of the water that was next to him. I think what worried him was the inquiry's interest in the difference between the American policy of regime change, the British stated policy of disarmament. After all, Jack Straw, the former Foreign Secretary, had said regime change in his view was illegal and illegitimate, and he wouldn't have gone along with it. And yet here, Tony Blair argued today, they were essentially two sides of the same coin. There was one phrase that stuck in my mind, Fiona. Tony Blair said force was always an option. He was talking about before 9/11, before George Bush was even president. If necessary, he said, we were going to remove him. Remove him. Regime change. My hunch is it was always in his mind.
Nick Robinson, thank you. Coming up on tonight's programme, we scale new heights with cricketer Andrew Flintoff as he sets up home in Dubai. Toyota is recalling some 200,000 cars in the UK because of a safety scare over the accelerator pedal. 8 of its 11 UK models, including the best-selling Yaris, are included. Owners of the cars involved will be contacted directly by the company. Similar problems in Toyota cars across the world have led to the recall of millions of cars in total. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson reports.
Toyota is the world's biggest car company, producing some 8 million vehicles a year. And that's about the same number it's now got to fix in an unprecedented global recall. The main problem? In a small number of cases, the accelerator pedals become stuck. Derek McCall thinks this may have happened to him. He had an accident last year, though Toyota said it couldn't find anything mechanically wrong.
It was running away with me. I think I must have taken my foot off the accelerator. It just went on and on and on, and then turned the corner and crashed.
Toyota gave him a new car, but now this one is about to be recalled. So, which models will now have to be fixed? The list involves 2/3 of Toyota's entire range here in the UK, and some of its most popular models, like the Yaris. Toyota says none of the cars affected was produced before 2005, but it does add up to more than 200,000 vehicles.
Reputation is a very important thing in the car business. It's what gets people through the showroom doors. And in this instance, with Toyota, who built their reputation on making reliable cars and providing good customer service, recall on this scale is a pretty bad thing.
Toyota declined to give us an interview, but said in a statement, "The action is a preventative measure aimed to guarantee the highest safety standards to all customers. Only a limited number of incidents have been reported in Europe, and we are not aware of any accident resulting from this issue." Toyota's not the only car producer wrestling with a safety recall. Tonight, Honda said it needed to fix a problem with the electric windows in its popular Jazz model. 172,000 cars in the UK are affected. It's not what these companies need as they try to recover from the global downturn. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
After a further 2 days of talks, there is still no sign of a deal in Northern Ireland, where negotiations to resolve the impasse over the devolution of policing powers continue. The DUP leader Peter Robinson says he won't be tied to deadlines or threats from the British and Irish Prime Ministers. The two governments had told the DUP and Sinn Féin to agree a deal by today, or they would publish their own proposals. The High Court has lifted an injunction preventing the media reporting details about the private life of the England and Chelsea captain John Terry. The footballer won an interim order at a private hearing last Friday. A newspaper was about to publish the details of an alleged affair with an unnamed woman. More than 2 weeks after the earthquake in Haiti, there are still no signs of the tented villages the government there has been promising. More than 1 million people were left homeless by the earthquake, which flattened most of the capital, Port-au-Prince. As our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes discovered, it's still only the aid agencies who are pitching tents.
After 17 days of misery, finally there is something to laugh about in Haiti. These 300 tents from Britain are the first proper camp for refugees in Port-au-Prince. But they are a tiny fraction of what's needed. Right now, there are not enough of these tents in the world to house all Haiti's refugees.
I mean, we're talking about huge numbers of tents. It's not like tents are just widely available. It takes time to make them.
You say you want 200,000 tents immediately, but that's not going to happen because the tents don't exist.
Exactly. It's not going to happen immediately. They're not there.
But down at the Haitian government, confusion reigns. The man charged with building large-scale tent cities says construction is underway.
We have water, there will be electricity, we have spaces.
We've driven about half an hour outside of Port-au-Prince to an area the government tells us they are preparing the first mass tent city for refugees from the earthquake. Well, we haven't been able to find any sign of it. No construction, no preparations at all. Instead, we found this. This is reconstruction Haitian style. With nothing but a machete and some scraps of metal, they're building a village.
Where do you sleep? Where do you live?
We're sleeping in the ground. We're sleeping in the ground. We have it.
You don't have. Do you have a tent? Do you have any shelter?
No, we have nothing.
Nearby, we found Salna Dauvoisier. Her leg was crushed in the earthquake and had to be amputated. She tells me she has absolutely no medicine and hasn't eaten anything for 4 days. Despite the massive response of the outside world, these people are still waiting for help. And for 1 million Haitians, tonight will be another spent in the open. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in Croix-de-Bouquet, Haiti.
Tennis, and it's Roger Federer who stands between Andy Murray and a first Grand Slam win for Britain's #1 player. It took Federer just...
I know that he'd like to win the first for British tennis since, 150,000 years, so...
Cheeky. Now, having retired from Test cricket at the end of last year's Ashes series, Andrew Flintoff says he's ready to take on the new challenge of playing in the Indian Premier League. In preparation, he's moved his family to Dubai, where he's been talking to our sports correspondent, Ollie Foster.
Andrew Flintoff's getting fit again. This was his first time back in the gym since another knee operation 2 weeks ago. He was supposed to be playing in the Indian Premier League in March, then for Lancashire, and ultimately the England one-day side, but the comeback's been delayed by another 6 months.
All of a sudden I'm feeling a bit flabby, a bit fat again, having not done a great deal. And I know for a fact now that in the gym over the next few weeks it's going to be building up, doing all the boring stuff again.
There are pluses, of course, more time with the family. His wife and 3 children have settled in well in Dubai. He fits in his rehabilitation around the school run.
I mean, I know what he's been through, the diets he's been on, everything, and he is so... You're really good. Once you've got something in your mind, he goes for it much better than me.
Why Dubai? Well, geographically, it's the perfect base for his ambition to be a global freelance cricketer. He's been made an official ambassador to help promote the city, a city that may inspire Flintoff in return. It's had its own setbacks, but still tries to do things bigger and better than anyone else.
I remember when I was a kid, my mum and dad took us up Blackpool Tower. I nearly passed out at Blackpool Tower. So, someone might have to catch me in a few minutes.
Thankfully, there were no wobbles as we went up the tallest building in the world.
Oh, great. You don't get stuck there.
And he hasn't wavered in his belief that he can still play at the highest level.
You know, there's a desire to play one-day internationals for England. It seems everyone's got an opinion on whether I will or I won't, but you know, that's down to them. However, I feel that if I'm fit and playing well, I get in England's best side.
There's a big Indian community here, cricket fanatics who recognise one of the sport's biggest stars and what he's achieved. But the Flintoff story isn't finished yet. Ollie Foster, BBC News, Dubai.
Well, there's more national and international news on the BBC News channel. But now we can join our news teams where you are. Bye-bye.
Good evening from BBC London News. I'm Catherine Carpenter. There's been a dramatic turnabout in the trial of a man accused of murdering his colleague and scattering his body parts across 2 counties. Stephen Marshall from Boreham Wood has now changed his plea to guilty. 3 weeks into the trial, he now admits killing and dismembering 49-year-old Geoffrey Howe last year. Sarah Harris reports.
Police have started to piece together the mystery of body parts found scattered in 3 separate locations.
First and foremost, they've got to find out exactly who this person is.
Over a period of 9 days now, 3 gruesome discoveries.
As body parts were discovered across Hertfordshire last year, it soon became clear they were from the same man. That man, it emerged, was Geoffrey Howe from North London. Today at St Albans Crown Court, Stephen Marshall stood in the dock in a baggy grey shirt, and when the murder charge was put to him for the second time, he replied, "Guilty, my lord."
Stephen Marshall moved to this ground floor flat on this very quiet street in Southgate with his colleague Geoffrey Howe. He now admits to killing him and dismembering his body parts and then leaving them in remote places across 2 counties.
The court heard the flat was owned by Geoffrey Howe, and after he was killed, Stephen Marshall began to use his bank account and sold his car on eBay. It was in Cottred in Hertfordshire on March the 22nd last year when Mr Howe's left leg severed at the thigh was found wrapped in blue plastic. It was just the first of many gruesome finds. Marshall from Boreham Wood had previously admitted to dismembering the body but not of murder. But neighbours say the man they knew showed no signs of what he was capable of.
My mum had spoken to him a few times and she said that he just seemed like a nice chap, you know, just standing out. I think there was one time where he had to go at some kids because they were on his lawn or something like that, but he never seemed like the kind of person who you'd associate with a crime like that.
Stephen Marshall was on trial alongside his girlfriend Sarah Bush, who still denies murdering and dismembering Mr Howe. Sarah Harris, BBC London News.
A former bank worker from North London has been cleared of stealing nearly £1 million. Anya Wordsworth admitted taking the money from Lloyds TSB in Golders Green, but she said she was forced to do it by her drug-addicted boyfriend. Keith Preddy from Romford was found guilty of laundering £145,000. A High Court judge has lifted a gagging order brought by the Chelsea and England football captain John Terry, preventing allegations about his private life being published. Lawyers for Mr Terry had obtained the injunction a week ago after learning that a newspaper planned to write about an alleged affair with the former girlfriend of a Chelsea teammate. A series of tube strikes has been announced, with hundreds of RMT union members staging a